All right, well, thanks for coming today. For those viewing on the college cable channel, my name is Keith St Clair. I teach political science here at Grand Rapids Community College. So American government, international relations. This last year I had the opportunity to go to the country of Qatar in the Middle East, an Arab country, and this was really an opportunity that was arranged through the National Council for U.S. Arab Relations. It's an organization that attempts to educate Americans about the Arab world, and I was one of many faculty and students that got to go to, I guess we were a group of maybe about 15, if that's many, and we got to spend a week in Doha, Qatar, learning about the history, the culture, the politics, with the intent that I would come back and share what I learned with my students, with the community, and so on. So for that purpose, I'm very happy to be able to do this talk. This is the national flag of Qatar. Like I said, it's an Arab emirate. I've called this talk the rebel emirate because Qatar's, if you followed the news recently, kind of been isolated. And there's an economic embargo by some of the other Arab states, led by Saudi Arabia. And so we're going to get into why that's the case. I want to talk a little bit about how Qatar came to be. I want to talk about how it sees its place in the world, which is really what has instigated the recent foreign policy isolation. And it's all really occurred within this Cold War that continues between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So with that, this is where Qatar is on the map. This is the Arabian Peninsula here. And Qatar is just this little thumb that juts out. It's not very big. It's about 100 miles long and about 50 miles wide. So I think it's comparable in size to the state of Connecticut. So it's pretty small geographically. And population-wise, it only has about 2.3 million people. And the vast majority of them live in the cities. And I think 60% of the population lives in the capital of Doha. And Doha has become this, world-class city in many respects. And yet, even 100 years ago, it was just a small fishing village. I mean, it's rather amazing. Now, the reason why it has grown in importance is obviously the fossil fuels and the wealth that comes from oil and natural gas. In the middle of the Persian Gulf here, between Iran and Qatar, is one of the largest natural gas fields. And Qatar has become fabulously rich, most recently exporting liquefied natural gas. And it's interesting to note that Iran is a Persian country. They speak Persian, and on the other side of the Gulf are these Arab countries where the dominant language is Arabic. And so Qatar is an Arab country. The dominant language is the local Arab dialect. So Saudi Arabia is an Arab country. The United Arab Emirates, Oman, Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, Libya, Lebanon. So you're familiar with the Arab world. And historically, the Arabs and the Persians did not get along. They fought each other, even though the Persians adopted Islam from the Arabs. Historically, politically, they've been adversaries throughout much of history. And that is kind of playing out now between Saudi Arabia and Iran, fighting for dominance in this power vacuum that was left after the United States toppled Saddam Hussein of Iraq. Up until then, 2003, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was the dominant military power in the region. And when Saddam Hussein was overthrown by the United States, it created a vacuum. Power abhors a vacuum. And Iran and Saudi Arabia have attempted to step into that. And obviously, them being rivals, that has spilled out in the various wars that are going on in the region. And yet there was a time over 100 years ago when the Al Sauds of Saudi Arabia, the Al Thanis, which is the ruling family of Qatar, the Khalifas, the ruling family of Bahrain, and the Sabahs, the ruling family of Kuwait, they were all Bedouin tribes. And along the coast, many of them engaged in some cases, piracy. Up until the 19th century, Qatar was really, very unimportant. It's really mostly isolated desert. There's not much farming that goes on there except in the north. The predominant trade was, well, I mean, it was a port. It was fishing was big. Pearl diving was huge. And what happened was this eventually came under the dominance of the Khalifas of Bahrain. Bahrain dominated Qatar, and then the Al Thanis basically made a treaty with the British in the 19th century, giving them status. The British made this treaty with them in the hopes of quieting down the piracy in this region. And by the end of the 19th century, that was done. And then the Turks came in, and they built a fort in Doha, and that was the way it was up until World War I. And the Al Thanis made their agreements with the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And then when they found the Ottoman Turkish Empire found itself on the wrong side of the British in World War I, the Al Thanis switched their allegiance to the British and saw in them the better protector. And then the Turks were kicked out. And really, Qatar remained a British protectorate all the way up until 1971. And that is equally true of the United Arab Emirates and Oman and Kuwait and Bahrain. And so, it was in the 1930s then that oil was discovered by the British, but they didn't really capitalize on it in Qatar until the late 1940s, early 1950s. And so after World War II, this is when Qatar all of a sudden finds itself, this Bedouin community all of a sudden fabulously rich with fossil fuel wealth. And the Al Thanis continued to rule up until the British protectorate ended in 1971, basically whereupon the Qatar trades its protection from the British for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, now the dominant Arab state, it was seen as a protector. It was seen as something that could replace the British. And so Qatar looked to Saudi Arabia for leadership and foreign policy protection. And that was the case up until Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And then all of a sudden, Saudi Arabia didn't look like an adequate protector because the United States was called in to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And it was there that Qatar and the Emirate saw that maybe their future really lied with that of the United States. And so now there's a major military base there outside of Doha, an Air Force base, and then also in Bahrain, there's a major U.S. naval base. Now what's interesting is that Qatar was originally supposed to be part of the United Arab Emirates, of which there are seven United Arab Emirates. Qatar and Bahrain were both supposed to join that. But because of the animosity between Bahrain and Qatar over a dispute of the islands off the coast here, they did not join the United Arab Emirates because they didn't think that their territorial claim would be furthered by joining the United Arab Emirates. So that's why Qatar ends up being its own solo emirate, and Bahrain as well. And that's why they did not join the UAE. The islands I'm talking about are right here off the northwest coast. They still remain part of Bahrain. The International Court of Justice ruled in favor of Bahrain's claim to Qatar's, and so they remain, much to Qatar's chagrin, a part of Bahrain. But the territorial claim has died down. I mean, Qatar seems to have accepted it, and they have attempted to move on. But note that Doha is really the one really metropolis on this peninsula, and it's become a major port, a major airport, a major city in all respects. And Qatar, through Doha, and its oil wealth, has attempted to really put itself on the international map. It's really sought out a higher profile for itself since the 20th century. This is the historical fort that remains in central Doha near the Bazaar. This would have been garrisoned by the Ottoman Turks when they ruled it up until World War I, or when they occupied it, were providing protection. Now, obviously, the Qatari flag flies above it. It's worth noting that the Qataris have a pretty capable military, despite its small size. And in fact, during the first Gulf War with Iraq, Qatari forces made a good account of themselves, fighting alongside the Americans. As I said, up until the 1930s, Qatar was a major source of pearls. Pearl diving off the coast of Qatar was really how these small communities on the coast really made their living. And there was wealth to be made, but again, compared to the wealth today, it was nothing. I mean, it was just, Qatar before World War II was really just a backwater. I mean, very small population, not much of anything. And what really ended the pearl industry for them was the Japanese. The Japanese domesticated pearl fishing. So after that, they didn't need any more wild pearls from the Persian Gulf. And so the pearl industry collapsed for them. And really just in the nick of time for them to discover oil and no longer need pearl diving or fishing as much, although they still do fishing. And this is modern Doha. And the landscaping, the architecture is phenomenal, it's world class. They made a world class city. The country's fabulously wealthy. In fact, since they've gained so much wealth, they've really imported a lot of foreign labor to do a lot of the work that a lot of Qataris don't want to do. The indigenous Qataris, for the most part, work for the government. And in many ways, the state is really the Al Thani family. And but this is kind of the layout of Doha, and they've built up this region up here called the Pearl for a lot of wealthy foreigners to actually live. Here's the airport down here. This is the old city center of Doha, where you found the fort, and then the bazaar, and then the hotels are all located along the Corniche here. The Pearl up here, I got a picture of that. You got these fabulous yachts. I mean, so this is where a lot of the wealthy foreigners live. But keep in mind that Qatar takes in foreigners from all over the world, but mainly Pakistan, South Asia, in other words, other Arab countries, even Iranians working in Qatar. And unfortunately, a lot of these immigrants have been doing very hard jobs, and they haven't been necessarily treated very well historically by the Qataris. And Qatar has recently tried to live that down. They've recently tried to initiate reforms to clean up their international reputation. The reputation was one of exploiting foreigners and depriving them of rights, and in many cases, some of them, well, it was like a couple years ago, there were like 1,200 Nepalese that died in construction accidents that were a span of a few years, and there was worries about worker safety. So Qatar is trying to live down that and kind of reform the process. It's interesting to note that there's a long history of that, and up until like even the late 40s, early 50s, slavery was common in this part of the world. So African slaves had been incorporated in the pearl diving industry. And so slavery lasted quite late in this region. And of course, after that, the harsh treatment of these foreigners, or the fact that many foreigners were brought in as workers, and they were not allowed to leave if they without their sponsor, which is basically the person they were working for, he was accountable for all of their debts. So they couldn't leave until that was served. So they were kind of like indentured servants for a long time. So this is kind of the history that Qatar itself is trying to shed. Obviously, there's a lot of wealthy foreigners there too. And they obviously are doing quite well. And I saw people, British, Europeans, all over. In fact, what's shocking is the number of foreigners that are in the country. Anywhere, the CIA World Factbook has it around 12%. I was told when I was there it was like closer to like 17%, are actually indigenous Qataris. The rest of them are all foreigners. So we're talking about anywhere from 80 to 90% of the population being immigrants that are not citizens, that are just there for work. And so you've got a small population of indigenous Qataris who are fabulously wealthy because the government takes care of them. They're employed by the government. The government has access to all of this oil and natural gas wealth. And they're very well taken care of. And so these Qataris have imported all this foreign labor to do the works that they don't want to do. So most of the private sector of the economy is all foreigners. In fact, when I arrived and went into the hotel, I think it was like, with the exception of the people who met me at the airport, who were indigenous Qataris, like for the first day, before the next day when we actually went out to the government ministries, everybody I was met was a foreigner. You know, talked to people at the hotel. Are you Qatari? No. There was very few, and most of the Qataris I did meet worked for the government. This creates an incredible potential problem going forward. I mean, it's a security concern for the Qataris because if the foreigners were so inclined and they were organized, they could clearly take over the country, being so many of them. And so it is it's a concern of national security for the government that foreigners don't organize, that they don't become politically active, and perhaps not stay too long. This is the Mall of Qatar, just outside Doha. I kind of compare it to the Mall of America, if you've ever been there. Again, it's just another example. I was just going to go in and look around the place. I wasn't really interested in shopping, but it took me 2.5 hours to see the whole mall. That's how big it was. It did remind me a lot of the Mall of America. And it's just another way that Qatar is trying to put itself on the international stage. And that drive and that ambition is both important in understanding Qatar itself and also understanding a little bit of why they have problems with Saudi Arabia now. Here's a traffic jam in Qatar. And you can see that there's not many trees. I mean, it's pretty barren, most of the country. Just desert, sand, rock. Very little vegetation. They do grow some food in the north. Here's the palace where the emir, the Al Thani family, hold official government events. And obviously they've a well-manicured lawn that they've watered, which wouldn't grow there normally. Here's some of the police on horseback in the Bazaar. The Qataris have this like national uniform. There's this white robes with this white head covering, and you know, it's just they look impeccable in it, really. And the Qataris themselves are very, very conservative, politically, religiously. Like the Saudis, they are followers of the Wahhabi school of Sunni Islam. And the Wahhabis are a very fundamentalist form of Islam, very strict in their interpretation. But be that as it may, the Qataris are a little bit more pragmatic than their Saudi cousins. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, not only are they very strict, but the women's dress code is more strict. Women are more restricted as far as what they can do. And foreigners themselves are also very restricted. But I think it's perhaps because of the practicality of having so many foreigners in their country that Qatar is Qataris are more tolerant of other religions. For example, there's now a Christian church in Qatar where foreigners can practice their faith. And so the women that were in our group, they did not have to be covered in any way. And in fact, the women I saw in Qatar, they were very assertive. They were working for the government. They can drive. The majority of people in the Qatari university are women. Women outnumber men there. So they're very well educated, and they work and they have a higher profile. I've never been to Saudi Arabia, but the women there have to wear the burqa. They were covered, but you could see their face in Qatar. So it's not quite as restricted. Falconry is a major sport in Qatar, and you saw falcons being sold in the bazaars. Camel racing is also very popular, but also kind of scandalous. Up until recently, Qatar faced a lot of international condemnation for the treatment of their camel jockeys, which were children, right? So them being small and children that would ride on the camels, and it was a harsh life. And so since then, in the last 10 years, Qatar has sworn off using children as camel jockeys, and they now use robots. So if you look closely at this photo, you'll see that these jockeys are actually robots. So they still race the camels, but modern technology has allowed them to continue their practice and their love of the sport without actually having to treat children poorly. And this photo down here is what it used to look like when they actually had children on the camels. This is the Museum of Islamic Art. They've built this world-class art museum in Doha, showcasing Islamic art, not just from Qatar. Actually, most of it wasn't from Qatar. Most of it was from just the Middle Eastern world, and even a lot of Iranian art. And it's a very impressive building in its architecture and in its displays, even some modern versions of Islamic art. This is the campus of the Qatar University. Qatar only has one university, but they also, in this education city, they also have campuses from American colleges, colleges across the world that have extension campuses here. And so we saw international students from all over. And this was our delegation. This was the, like I said, me and other faculty and students who were chosen on this Malone Fellowship by the National Council for U.S. Arab Relations to go to Qatar, all paid for by the Qatar government, including our flights from D.C. to Doha. And yes, our accommodations were fantastic. And so this was the size of our group. And many of these students have actually participated in the Model Arab League that the National Council for U.S.-Arab Relations sponsors throughout the United States, including the one here in Michigan at Grand Valley State University. Qatar is also very proud of the fact that they are going to be hosting the 2022 World Cup soccer. They are counting down the months, the days, the hours, and they are seeing this as another opportunity for their coming out party to the world. You know, for them, it might as well be the Olympics. And yet, when they were awarded the site for the 2022 World Cup, it was tinged with scandal because FIFA, which is the governing body of World Cup soccer, was alleged to have accepted bribes in its determining of sites for its World Cup soccer matches. And so there's been a hint of scandal, but the Qataris pay it no mind. They're fully invested, and they're going to make it a party. And they're going to make it a party that showcases Doha to the rest of the world. And here's the kind of an Olympic-sized torch on the sports complex that they've built, not only for the World Cup, but for international sports in general, that they've been hosting international competitions for years. And again, all with the intent of showcasing their country. And so these were a couple people working on the marketing of the World Cup coming to Doha. And this woman, she worked for the government. And as you can see, she's dressed conservatively, but it's not like Saudi Arabia where her face has to be covered and her, where all you can see is her eyes. On the contrary, and she was very not only friendly, but assertive and had a very prominent role in this. And so from what I could see, you know, it is a male-dominated society for sure, but at least the indigenous women that were educated working in government seemed pretty free to speak their mind. Some of the other women that I met, you know, like I said, the Wahhabi sect of Sunni Islam is very strict and rigid, and the Qataris in some ways are even more conservative in that way than even the Saudis. But they're more pragmatic. Like I said, they have many more foreigners living in their land, therefore they're forced to be more tolerant of others, and therefore I think in some ways maybe that has affected maybe why the women have a little bit more rights maybe than in Saudi Arabia. This is Al Jazeera News Network, their world headquarters. Al Jazeera is based in Doha. It is funded by the Qatari government, and no doubt you've heard of it. It's since September 11th, it's become internationally known. It developed really before the 21st century, when the Qatari emir found that the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, was ending their Arab broadcast out of Saudi Arabia. He hired a bunch of the BBC reporters, said, set up shop here, I'll give you free reign, freedom of the press, and you can become an international satellite news service, which they did. Now, there's a caveat to that, though, is that Al Jazeera getting all of its funding from the Qatari government, it doesn't criticize the Qatari government, I must say. And for that matter, it usually stays clear of criticizing the Saudi government too much either. But in other respects, it's been incredibly progressive and shocking in some ways. It has gained an international reputation for a reliable news source, and also in many ways did a lot of the coverage from the Arab point of view of the invasion, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, during the Arab Spring in 2011, you remember all those Arab revolutions that were breaking out across the Arab world. Al Jazeera was covering the rebels, or the protesters, the man on the street that brought down Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, the dictator of Egypt. And it was actually giving voice to the Muslim Brotherhood and even hosting the Muslim Brotherhood. And when the Muslim Brotherhood took over Egypt, many people thought maybe there was an opportunity, but obviously the Muslim Brotherhood didn't express a liberal viewpoint in its rule, and the backlash against that was that the Egyptian military stepped in and retook the government. And there's a lot of lingering resentment amongst the Egyptian military and the current government now of Egypt against Qatar for the way it paid for Al Jazeera's coverage. They gave the Muslim Brotherhood a little bit more favorable light. The Muslim Brotherhood, if you're not familiar with it, is a fundamentalist Muslim party, political party, that has various affiliates throughout the Arab world. In the case of Hamas, which is their Palestinian affiliate, the United States considers that, Hamas, a terrorist organization, in that it's because of its hostility to Israel. But the Muslim Brotherhood's rule in Tunisia has been a little bit, they've lost power. They stepped down after they lost elections. So it's not like Hamas is necessarily reflective of all affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood, but nevertheless, it's irritated Saudi Arabia and it's irritated the government of Egypt. And that's part of the reasons why you have the current embargo, economic embargo against Qatar. Here's the inside the newsroom of Al Jazeera. We also went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, learning about Qatar's foreign policy. And here we are, our U.S. representative providing a gift to our host. This photo, I guess, I took as an example of the close U.S.-Qatari relations. I mentioned before that, since the first Gulf War against Iraq, the United States has built a major military base just outside of Doha, an Air Force base, on which I think there's about 10,000 U.S. soldiers. We also have a major naval base in Bahrain. So we have a military investment in Qatar, and this has only become more problematic and complicated given the current situations developed over the last year. What happened, and this was after my visit, I was there the last week of April 2017. And when I was there, the Qataris actually had high hopes for the new President Trump. President Trump was kind of looked fondly on by a lot of the Arab world. I mean, they understood him. I mean, he's a strong man. He spoke strongly. Many of them had been disappointed in President George W. Bush for invading Iraq, destabilizing the region. Then came Barack Obama, and Barack Obama was not well thought of by much of the Arab world either, because he seemed to reflect some kind of disengagement. Many thought that President Trump, because of the way he campaigned, that he was going to be a strong leader and a strong ally of Qatar. Well, at least in the case of Qatar, that has been a disappointment, because come June of last year, 2017, after Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, where the Saudis apparently ran by him their ideas on how they would like to cow Qatar, which they felt is kind of an upstart emirate that's kind of gotten ahead of itself, and they wanted to rein in. They imposed an economic embargo. So Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates have basically shut off economic ties, closed the border with Qatar as a means to punish Qatar for various reasons. One, the Saudis alleged that Qatar is a little too economically close to Iran. And although that's true, they do have economic ties to Iran, and Iran, for good reason, they do share the natural gas field out in the Persian Gulf with them. But it's not just Qatar that trades with Oman or with Iran. Oman does as well. Even some of the Emirates do. So it's hard to see that in isolation as the reason. Part of it is speculated that Al Jazeera has irritated Saudi Arabia in its promotion of the Muslim Brotherhood's perspectives. Qatar is kind of struck out on its own. It now relies on the United States militarily, not so much the Saudis. But it's really perhaps best understood in context of this Cold War that's going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia has made some big decisions lately that haven't gone so well. One, Saudi Arabia supported the rebellion in Syria. Right? And Assad, the dictator of Syria, obviously is winning that civil war with the help of the Russians, with the help of the Iranians. There's also a civil war going on in Yemen, which is just to the south of Saudi Arabia, where the Houthis have been very successful, and Saudi Arabia alleges that Iran has been helping them. And that war is not going so well. Saudi's intervention in that war has pretty much just resulted in a stalemate and not a decisive victory. And for that matter, the embargo against Qatar hasn't been going that well either, in that Qatar has been managing economically pretty well since last summer. Oman has continued to trade with Qatar, and Oman is an Arab country. Turkey has close ties to Qatar. They continue to trade with Iran. So despite the threat from Saudi Arabia, Qatar has been, on the streets of Qatar, the things are available. It's not like they're being brought economically to their knees, I think, like the Saudis had hoped. So the Saudi Arabia's adventure in Syria is not going so well. Saudi Arabia's adventure in Yemen has not been going so well. Saudi Arabia's economic embargo of Qatar is not going so well. And all the while, Iran seems to be gaining prestige and power internationally. The other thing that Saudi Arabia alleged with regards to Qatar is that Qatar had ties to terrorism. Probably they're alluding to the fact that they have hosted the Muslim Brotherhood. But that's a little rich from the Saudi point of view, because Saudi Arabia itself has had numerous ties to funding organizations that end up becoming terrorist. And initially, at least, even in Syria, ISIS initially benefited greatly before they got out of hand and Saudis cut off aid to them. So it's really hard to fully explain why it is that Saudi Arabia has this animosity, but you really have to understand it in the fact that Saudi Arabia sees Iran as their adversary, and Qatar, from their point of view, has made that adversarial relationship even more difficult. that Qatar is kind of not towing the line, as it were, from the Saudi Arabian point of view. And I guess there I might as well mention well, it's not just an ethnic difference between the Iranians and the Arabs, right? The Iranians speak Persian, which is an Indo-European language. Arabic, spoken on this side of the Persian Gulf by Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, is a Semitic language. Arabic is a Semitic language more akin to Hebrew, Aramaic. Whereas Persian is an Indo-European language, is closer to German. That it's European. But it's not just the ethnic rivalries, but Iran is predominantly Shiite Muslim. It is the largest Shiite Muslim country, where most Arabs are Sunni Muslims. And I think a lot of Americans maybe are confused on the distinction, but really the difference between Sunni and Shiite Muslims goes back to the very foundation of the faith. But it's something that Christians can relate to, because there was a similar struggle in early Christianity, and that being who was the proper authority for the faith. In the case of Islam, Muhammad was the last prophet of God. There are to be no more prophets after him. Muhammad lived in the early 7th century. So that's how long ago we're talking. And when Muhammad died, Muhammad was both not only a new religious leader, but a political figure, and he had formed the beginning of an Arab state in Arabia that ended up becoming the foundation of what would become the Arab Empire, that would go on to spread throughout Africa and the Middle East, become a fabulous civilization, and rule for centuries. When Muhammad died, he never lived to see that fulfillment. He consolidated power and created a state within Arabia, but it never really got beyond that. And then he died. And then it was the question of who should be the authority for this for the faith in his absence. Shiites believed that it needed to be a blood descendant of Muhammad. Sunnis did not accept that. They thought it could just be an elder from the Quraysh tribe, which was Muhammad's tribe. So there was a dispute, and the Shiites lost. The Shiites revered as the leader, they saw the proper leader as Ali, who was Muhammad's cousin and married Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. And the Shiites believed that the children of Ali and Fatima should be the proper successors and authority for the faith. The Sunni Muslims didn't accept that. Muhammad didn't have any male children that lived to adulthood. He had a daughter. He had several daughters, but Fatima married Ali, and that's who the Shiites follow. So Shiites are kind of partisans of Ali. And so Iran is dominated by Shiites. Shiites are a minority through most of the Muslim world, with 4 exceptions. One is Iran, one is Bahrain, and the other is Iraq and Azerbaijan are the 4. And even though Iraq is an Arab country, and so is Bahrain for that matter, Shiites are actually in the majority there. So in Qatar, it's predominantly Sunni. Saudi Arabia is predominantly Sunni. And I should say that the successors to the Prophet, from the Shiites' point of view, were all hunted down and killed by the Sunnis. And there's a lot of lingering resentment by the Shiites against the Sunnis for that purpose. Lest you think that we can't relate to this, in Christianity we have a similar story. After Christ died, rose from the dead, ascended to heaven, as the story goes, there was a lot of dispute amongst Christianity about who should be the proper authority for the faith in the absence of Christ in physical form. And there were those Christians who believed that since Rome was the capital of the empire, that the Bishop of Rome should naturally be the authority for the faith. And those Christians became known as Roman Catholics. The Bishop of Rome became known as the Pope. There were other Christians who said, no, we've got a new capital of the empire, that being Constantinople, which is now today Istanbul. And so they thought the Bishop of Constantinople should be the authority for the faith. And those Christians became known as Eastern Orthodox Christians. And so, you have the first major split in Christianity between the Roman Catholics looking to the Bishop of Rome for leadership, the Eastern Orthodox looking to the Bishop of Constantinople for leadership. What's interesting is that today in Sunni and Shiite Islam, there is no one that really claims to be the authority for the faith. It's much more decentralized than that. For years, the Sunnis looked to somebody called the caliph. Caliph was the Arab word for successor. But the Ottoman Turks captured the caliph and the title. And the Ottoman Turkish Sultan, after World War I, was deposed and gave up the title. And since then, nobody has claimed the title that has been accepted. The last Shiite imam, with imam with a capital I, meaning not just prayer leader, but the leader, was killed. Well, they were all killed by the Sunnis. The last one, though, is thought to have escaped. The 12th imam is in hiding to this day, and he's thought, according to Shiites, to return one day with Jesus Christ at his side, where they will restore peace on earth. So the Shiites are awaiting the return of this 12th imam, Messiah figure. They consider Jesus a prophet, but they don't consider Jesus the Son of God. The Sunni Muslims are not waiting for anybody. So there's that difference, that sectarian differences that explain the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as the ethnic differences. And it's just that Qatar is kind of caught in the crossfire. Qatar has naturally had more closer relations to Iran. Saudi Arabia resents that. Saudi Arabia also resents Qatar's Al Jazeera news service as promoting people that Saudi Arabia doesn't care for. And so that's a large part of it. Anyway, that's probably a good place to stop. I can open it up to questions if there are any. Yes?
Trump campaigned fairly heavily on having the Gulf states pay for American military intervention. Were they open to that
idea? To some extent. What intervention are you referring to?
Any type of American future.
Going forward,
yeah.
Or historically?
Going forward.
Yeah, no, there was no talk of that when I was there. No. I mean, I don't know what Trump hasn't. I haven't heard much talk of Trump, President Trump speaking of any intervention to come either. But yeah, he has. Donald Trump has. I remember that during the campaign. Not only was Mexico going to pay for the wall, but our allies were all going to pay for our military. But he said he made the same claim about NATO, if you remember.
Yeah.
He felt that the United States' contribution to the defense of Europe was costing America too much, and he said the Europeans are going to have to pay more. Well, we haven't seen much there either. But no, I did not hear anyone voice, or it wasn't even on their radar as far as talking about the fact that they were going to have to cough up and pay for more of. I mean, they already provide a lot. I mean, they're hosting. The United States, the U.S. has a major military base outside of Doha, so Qatar has coughed up a lot of the expense for that. So it's not like they haven't paid anything. I don't know what more President Trump is asking for. I think he left that pretty ambiguous.
You mentioned earlier that the majority of the government is maintained by Qataris. However, the majority of the workforce and people who live within Qatar are not actually Qatari.
Yes, that's exactly right.
You also suggested that it would not be unfeasible or at least not difficult for, not necessarily like a revolution, but for people living within Qatar to sort of seize control of the country, and that could be a possible problem for them in the future.
It has to be a national security concern,
yeah.
Right? It has to be. The fact that there have that many foreigners. I mean, you already see it here in the United States, right? President Donald Trump thinks we have too many foreigners. Could you imagine if 85 to 90% of the population was foreigner? I mean, President Trump would be going ballistic. I mean, that would be a national security concern. And the Qataris have to be aware of that. And they are.
Do you believe that, other Emirati states such as Bahrain and United Arab Emirates would intervene should such a thing happen?
Well, I mean, that's your speculation is as good as mine. I suppose, I guess I can imagine, yeah.
I guess
To the extent that they have a similar problem, although I haven't been to the United Arab Emirates and I haven't been to Bahrain, so I can't really speak to that.
I guess my question is would be better articulated by asking, do you think that the Emirati identity is stronger than that of maybe the Arab identity in the area?
Well, they're all Arabs.
Yes.
Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, they're all Arabs. The fact that they're Emirates, that means they're ruled by a royal family.
Right. In
the United Arab Emirates, there's 7 of them that form together to create one state. So if you're asking about what is the future of monarchy, our monarchical rule, I don't see any sign of that ending. I can tell you that during the Arab Spring, there were no major protests in Qatar. The indigenous Qataris seem pretty happy with their the amount of money that the Qatari government brings in and distributes to them, and they feel pretty secure in being able to get government jobs, which are the jobs that they seek in Qatar. Like I said, they leave most of the private economic sector to, and private businesses are foreign run. So apparently the indigenous Qataris don't seem unhappy with the fact that they have a monarchy, unhappy that they're ruled by a royal family, the Al Thanis, because most of them are related to the Al Thanis. In that sense, I kind of reminded me of Monaco. I've been to Monaco. There's a European principality. It's not a democracy. It's, the Prince of Monaco is the royalty, and he's, it's not, the people that live there, when I was in Monaco, didn't seem to be unhappy with that arrangement. They didn't seem to be clamoring for democracy. Again, Monaco's fabulously rich, so I guess as long as everybody's content with the cash, there's not much fermenting revolution. So I think the same is true for the indigenous Qataris. It might be more true for some of the immigrants maybe who don't see a wealthy, they don't have that wealth, and they work hard, and maybe in some cases they're not treated well.
Right,
but again, they're all speaking different languages. It'd be hard for them to effectively organize.
And as long as the Qataris control the state, that makes it a lot more challenging.
Yeah, and the Qataris do intend to continue controlling the state. Yeah, they're not, they're willing, I think, to, they've been talking and they've been trying to reform their reputation regarding the treatment of foreigners. That's true. And to that extent, then that's all for the good. But no, they're not extending citizenship to these foreigners. Not that they'd have the right to vote even if they were, right? But, they could vote for the local council, but the emir is the emir, right? And he is chosen amongst the elders, yeah.
Are they working on diversifying their industries? Because if they're so dependent on natural gas, doesn't that leave them pretty susceptible?
Yeah, I think like the Saudis, they are heavily investing in renewables like solar. They don't have, you can't go, you get a lot of sun there, right? So, solar power would seem to be a natural extension. And they're well aware of the fact that the fossil fuels are only going to serve them so long. I think in the near term, they're secure. But long range, once those fossil fuels run out, they realize they got to have alternative energy sources. And so, yeah, so solar is definitely something to be looked at. They even need, they're short of water too, right? So they use desalination plants to get their water from the ocean, their fresh water. And that's not cheap. Desalination of salt ocean water is not a cheap way to get fresh water, but they've got the money, so why not? And that's really the largest source of water available to them. A lot of the groundwater you can't drink. It's too many minerals and stuff in it. So they use it for irrigation for the plants that they grow, but they don't typically drink it. Any other questions? All right, well, hey, thank you for coming. Thanks for listening to my talk on Qatar. Hope you learned a little bit more about the country. All right, thanks.